November 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled to a stop outside a modest compound in rural Pennsylvania, and 23-year-old Heidi Zimmermann felt her stomach clench with a familiar emptiness that had nothing to do with fear. She had not eaten a proper meal in 8 months. None of them had. The 47 women crowding the truck bed had survived on watery soup, black bread that was more sawdust than grain, and occasional scraps that barely kept them standing during their final week serving the Reich in occupied France. Now, as American soldiers opened the truck's gate and gestured for them to step down, Heidi noticed something that made no sense. The smell of cooking meat drifted across the compound, rich, savory, impossible. Beside her, 22-year-old Gisela Braun gripped her threadbare coat tighter. "Do you smell that?" she whispered in German, her voice hoarse from the long journey across the Atlantic. Her eyes, sunken from months of inadequate rations, reflected confusion rather than hope. Heidi nodded, but said nothing. It had to be a trick. Some kind of psychological torment the Americans had devised for their prisoners. She had heard stories about what happened to captured soldiers. Surely this abundance was meant to break them somehow. The women were led into a long wooden building that served as the camp's mess hall. Inside, American soldiers and staff members moved with casual efficiency, setting up long tables with an ease that suggested this was routine. Heidi watched in disbelief as plates were placed before each seat. Real plates. Not the dented tin cups they had eaten from in France. Not the shared bowls that passed between 5 hungry mouths. Individual plates with actual portions meant for individual people. When the food arrived, carried by American soldiers who seemed almost bored with the task, the German women simply stared. On each plate sat a thick slice of meatloaf, glistening with brown gravy, a mound of white mashed potatoes with a pat of yellow butter melting into it, green beans that looked fresh rather than preserved, and 2 slices of white bread. Real white bread. Not the gray, dense bricks they had choked down for years. Actual, soft white bread that gave beneath gentle pressure. 27-year-old Wilhelmina Schultz, a nurse from Essen who had treated wounded soldiers with supplies that dwindled to almost nothing, began to cry silently. Tears ran down her gaunt cheeks and dropped onto her untouched plate. Around the hall, other women sat frozen, their hands in their laps, unable to comprehend what sat before them. An American guard, a young man who could not have been older than 20, noticed their paralysis. He approached Heidi's table with genuine concern on his face. "Ma'am, are you okay? Is something wrong with the food?" Heidi looked up at him, this enemy soldier, showing worry for her comfort, and managed to speak in her careful English. This is for us? All is of this?" The guard's confusion deepened. "Yes, ma'am, it's dinner time. You should eat before it gets cold." But none of them moved, because in their experience, meals like this only came on Sunday, and this was Tuesday. Gisela Braun remembered the last real meal she had eaten in Dusseldorf. It was March of 1943, nearly 2 years ago, before she had volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Her mother had saved ration coupons for weeks to prepare a birthday dinner. 1 small pork chop, boiled potatoes, and carrots from their struggling garden. At the time, Gisa had felt grateful. It had seemed like abundance compared to what her neighbors were eating. Now, sitting before this American plate loaded with more food than her entire family would have seen in a week, that memory felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, a different world where she understood how things worked. The rationing had started slowly in Germany, so gradually that at first it seemed manageable. A little less butter, smaller portions of meat. Then coffee became a luxury. Sugar disappeared from shops. By 1942, her mother was mixing sawdust into flour to make the bread rations stretch further. Everyone did it. Everyone pretended the gritty texture was normal, was acceptable, was temporary. The Reich assured them that sacrifice was necessary for victory, that their soldiers at the front needed the food more, that soon when they won the war, abundance would return. Gisa had believed it. They all had. When she joined the Auxiliary Corps and was sent to France to work as a supply clerk, she expected conditions would be better. The conquered territories were supposed to be rich with resources. Instead, she found the same hunger wearing different uniforms. The Wehrmacht took what it needed from French farms and left barely enough for the local population to survive. German personnel ate better than French civilians, but that was not saying much. Watery soup remained watery soup regardless of whose flag flew overhead. Her daily ration as an auxiliary worker in France consisted of a morning coffee made from roasted acorns, a slice of dark bread at midday with a scraping of margarine if supplies allowed, and an evening meal of thin vegetable soup with occasional bits of potato or turnip floating in the broth. Once every week or two, a small piece of sausage might appear. Those days felt like celebrations. The women would eat slowly, savoring every molecule of fat and protein, knowing it might be days before they tasted meat again. She had grown accustomed to the constant gnawing emptiness in her stomach, to the way her uniform hung looser each month, to the brittle feeling in her hair and the way her monthly cycles had stopped entirely. The other women experienced the same. They stopped discussing it after a while. Hunger became their normal state, as unremarkable as breathing. When she looked at her reflection, she no longer recognized the round-faced girl from Dusseldorf. The woman staring back had hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for her face. And now this impossible plate of food sat before her, steam still rising from the mashed potatoes, and Gisa could not reconcile these two realities. Wilhelmina Schultz had been washing surgical instruments in a basement field hospital outside Metz when the American artillery began. It was September of 1944, and the German retreat from France had become a chaotic scramble. The hospital, hastily established in an abandoned schoolhouse, had been treating wounded Wehrmacht soldiers for 3 weeks. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Mina performed surgeries with instruments sterilized only by boiling water. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Morphine had run out days earlier, leaving men to endure amputations with nothing but leather straps to bite down on. When the shelling stopped and American soldiers entered the building with weapons raised, Mina felt only exhaustion, not fear, not relief. Just the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been functioning on 2 hours of sleep per night for months. She raised her hands, still wet from washing scalpels in cold water, and waited to discover what came next. The American medics who followed their soldiers looked shocked at the conditions they found. Wounded men lying on bare floors, the smell of infection and death thick in the unventilated rooms. Mina standing in her stained nursing uniform, so thin that her auxiliary corps belt had been notched to its tightest setting and still hung loose. The Americans transported them to a temporary detention facility in eastern France. There, Mina met Heidi, Gisa, Trudy, and Linda, all captured during the same chaotic weeks of German withdrawal, all members of the Auxiliary Corps who had believed they were serving necessary support roles far from combat, all discovering that war made no distinction between front lines and rear positions when an army collapsed. They were processed as prisoners of war, given numbers, and held in converted barracks while Allied command decided what to do with female German personnel. The journey to America took 3 weeks aboard a Liberty ship. They crossed the Atlantic in the cargo hold, 47 women crowded into a space designed for supplies. The ship's crew, mostly American merchant marines, treated them with careful correctness. Not cruelty, but not kindness either. Just the professional distance of men transporting enemy prisoners. They received 1 meal per day during the crossing, a ladle of soup and a piece of bread, standard prisoner rations. Barely enough to sustain life, but sufficient to prevent starvation. Mina spent the voyage treating women who became seasick using nothing but cool cloths and whispered reassurances. She had no medicines, no supplies, just hands trained to comfort and a nursing instinct that functioned even when everything else had been stripped away. When they finally reached American soil and were loaded onto trucks for transport inland, she felt only numbness. Whatever came next could not be worse than what they had already endured, or so she believed until she smelled cooking meat and saw plates loaded with impossible abundance. Hiltrud Wagner woke before dawn in the women's barracks, her body trained by years of military routine to rise early regardless of exhaustion. The building was simple but sturdy, with real beds arranged in rows, actual mattresses, though thin, wool blankets that held warmth. After months of sleeping on wooden pallets covered with straw, the modest American accommodations felt almost decadent. She had barely slept anyway, too unsettled by the previous evening's inexplicable meal. They had eventually eaten, urged by increasingly confused American guards who seemed disturbed by their hesitation. Trudy had approached the food cautiously, expecting each bite to reveal some trick or poison. Instead, she discovered real meat, actual butter, bread with substance and flavor. Now, as gray morning light filtered through the barracks windows, she heard sounds from outside. Metal clanging, voices calling in English. The smell of coffee drifted through the walls. Real coffee, not the ersatz brew made from burned grain that Germany had been drinking for years. The women began stirring, exchanging uncertain glances. What would morning bring? Would yesterday's abundance vanish, revealed as the anomaly they expected? An American soldier, a woman in a crisp uniform, entered the barracks at 7 o'clock precisely. "Breakfast is served in the mess hall," she announced in clear English, then repeated the statement more slowly. "Breakfast, food, come eat." She gestured toward the door with a briskness that suggested this was routine, nothing special, just another morning in the camp's schedule. The German women dressed quickly and filed toward the mess hall in silence. Inside, they found tables set with plates, cups, and utensils. Steam rose from large serving trays. American staff members stood ready to distribute food with the same casual efficiency they had demonstrated the night before. This was clearly standard procedure. Not a special occasion, not a trick, just breakfast. Trudy watched in disbelief as an American cook placed food on her plate. 2 fried eggs with bright yellow yolks that had not been watered down or stretched with flour. 3 strips of bacon, actual pork bacon, crispy and fragrant. 2 slices of toasted white bread, a small cup of butter, a larger cup filled with steaming coffee that smelled rich and real, and fruit, a small dish containing sliced peaches in syrup. Fruit in November. Preserved fruit served casually, as if it were nothing remarkable. Around her, the other women received identical portions, 47 plates loaded with more protein and fat than they had consumed in entire weeks back home. Sieglinde Koch stared at her eggs with an expression approaching grief. 26 years old, a courier who had carried messages across occupied France, she had not seen an egg in over a year. Now 2 of them sat before her, prepared simply, offered without ceremony. The Americans expected them to eat this every morning, as if this were normal. Linda Koch could not sleep that night. She lay on her thin mattress staring at the dark ceiling, her stomach uncomfortably full for the first time in memory. 3 meals that day: breakfast with eggs and bacon, lunch with thick vegetable soup, actual chunks of beef floating in rich broth, and fresh bread with butter, dinner with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of apple pie that made her want to weep. Her body did not know how to process this quantity of food. Her stomach cramped and gurgled, unused to working so hard after months of having almost nothing to digest. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torment. This abundance could not continue. It defied everything she understood about how the world worked, about prisoner treatment, about wartime resource allocation. The Americans were feeding them better than German civilians ate even before the war began, better than Wehrmacht soldiers ate at the front, better than she had eaten in her entire life, including childhood Christmases when her family had saved for weeks to afford a proper feast. There had to be a reason, a purpose behind this excessive generosity that would reveal itself soon enough. The other women shared her paranoia. During their limited free time in the compound yard, they gathered in small groups and whispered theories in German. Gisa believed they were being fattened for medical experiments. She had heard rumors about American research programs, about prisoners used as test subjects. The abundant food was preparation, making them healthy enough to survive whatever procedures the doctors had planned. Heidi thought it was psychological warfare, a calculated effort to make them dependent on American provision so they would become compliant and willing to share intelligence about German operations. The food was bait, and eventually the trap would spring. Mina, with her nursing background, worried about poison. Not immediate lethal poison, but something subtle, mixed into the food that would take effect slowly over time. Perhaps the Americans were testing chemical agents, observing how they affected the human body through gradual exposure. She examined every meal carefully, looking for discoloration or unusual textures, trying to identify which component might contain the contaminating agent. Trudy feared they were being filmed, that cameras hidden in the mess hall were recording their reactions to abundance for propaganda purposes. The Americans would show German citizens footage of their captured women gorging themselves while families back home starved, turning them into symbols of betrayal and excess. Every meal became an exercise in terror. They ate because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting, but each bite carried the weight of anticipated consequences. When would the punishment come? What form would it take? The American guards watched them with expressions that seemed genuinely confused by their anxiety, which only deepened the mystery. Were the Americans such skilled actors that they could maintain this facade of innocent hospitality indefinitely? Or was something more sinister at work, something so beyond German understanding that they could not even properly identify the threat? Lindy lay awake, counting the days, waiting for the moment when everything would finally make terrible sense. Tuesday evening, November 21st. 9 days after their arrival at the Pennsylvania camp, Heidi Zimmermann entered the mess hall expecting the usual incomprehensible abundance. She had almost adjusted to the routine of 3 full meals daily, though her stomach still protested the quantity. The initial sharp fear had dulled into constant low-grade anxiety. Something bad would happen eventually, but perhaps not today, perhaps not this week. She could endure this strange limbo of well-fed captivity while waiting for the other shoe to drop. But tonight was different. The smell hit her first. Rich gravy, beef cooked with onions, something deeply savory that made her mouth water despite her intention to remain suspicious. When she reached the serving line, the American cook placed something on her plate that made her freeze completely. A large oval patty of seasoned ground beef covered in thick brown mushroom gravy. Mashed potatoes with butter pooled in a crater at the center. Roasted carrots glazed with something sweet. Dinner rolls, plural, 2 of them, soft and warm, and a slice of chocolate cake for dessert. Chocolate, a luxury that had disappeared from Germany in 1942. Heidi carried her plate to the table where Gisa, Mina, Trudy, and Linda already sat, all wearing identical expressions of shock. "What is this?" Gisa whispered in German. "This is Sunday dinner. My grandmother made meals like this only for Christmas and Easter." Her voice trembled. "Why are they giving us Sunday dinner on a Tuesday?" Around them, other German women murmured similar observations. This was not simply adequate food or even generous portions. This was celebration food, special occasion food, the kind of meal German families prepared maybe 4 times per year when they could afford the meat and butter and sugar required. The Americans were serving it on a random Tuesday in November as if it were completely ordinary. Mina turned to the nearest American guard, a middle-aged man from Iowa named Corporal William Harrison. She had been practicing English with him during yard time, and her vocabulary had improved enough for simple questions. "Excuse me, Corporal, today is special day? Holiday?" Harrison looked confused. "Special day? No, ma'am. Just Tuesday. Why will you ask?" Mina gestured at her plate with a shaking hand. This food. This is Sunday food, for special times only. The corporal's confusion deepened. He looked at the plates, then back at Mina, clearly trying to understand the problem. "Ma'am, this is just Salisbury steak. Regular dinner. We have it maybe once a week, rotation through different meals. Nothing special about Tuesday." The words landed like a physical blow. Once a week. They served celebration quality meals once a week as part of normal rotation, which meant the other meals, the ones that already seemed impossibly generous, were also just ordinary, standard, expected. Heidi felt something crack inside her chest, some fundamental understanding of how the world worked. If this was normal American food, if this was what prisoners received, what did actual American citizens eat? How could a country at war, fighting on two fronts across two oceans, have so much abundance that it fed enemy prisoners like honored guests? Gisa Braun began keeping a food diary on November 23rd. She found a small notebook in the camp library, and using a pencil stub borrowed from the education room, she started documenting every meal with obsessive detail. Not because she wanted to remember the food, though the abundance continued to shock her, but because she needed some way to quantify what was happening, some method to measure the impossible against the real. In Dusseldorf, she had worked as a supply clerk managing inventory and tracking resources. Numbers made sense to her. Documentation created order from chaos. If she could record what the Americans were feeding them, perhaps she could understand it. Her entries were precise. Breakfast. November 23rd, 2 scrambled eggs, 3 sausage links, fried potatoes, 2 slices white bread with jam, orange juice, coffee with cream and sugar. Lunch. Beef stew with potatoes and carrots, garden salad with dressing, cornbread, milk, oatmeal cookie. Dinner. Baked ham with pineapple, sweet potatoes, green beans, roll with butter, apple cobbler. She calculated rough caloric estimates based on her supply clerk training, between 2,500 and 3,000 calories per day. More than double what German civilians received on rations, more than Wehrmacht soldiers got at the front unless they were in active combat zones with supplemental field rations. She showed her notebook to Heidi one evening after dinner. "Look at this week's totals. We have consumed more meat in 7 days than my entire family ate in 2 months before I left Germany. More butter in 1 week than my mother's ration coupons allowed for 6 weeks. The sugar in yesterday's dessert alone exceeded our household monthly allowance." Heidi studied the figures with an expression of sick fascination. How can they afford this? America is fighting Japan, fighting Germany, sending supplies to Britain and Russia. Where does all this food come from? Gisa had been wondering the same thing. The mathematics did not work according to any economic model she understood. War required sacrifice, rationing, controlled distribution of limited resources. Every nation fighting in this war implemented strict food controls, except apparently America. She thought about the propaganda they had been fed in Germany. Stories about American weakness, American poverty, American citizens starving in breadlines during their economic depression. The images of desperate Americans waiting for soup handouts had been shown repeatedly in German newsreels, proof that democracy and capitalism created inequality and suffering. But if America had been so desperate, so poor, so weak in the 1930s, how had they transformed into this in barely a decade? How did a country that supposedly could not feed its own citizens now produce such overwhelming abundance that they casually gave chocolate cake to enemy prisoners? The contradiction made Gisa's head hurt. Either everything they had been told about America was lies, or this camp was an elaborate theatrical production designed to deceive them. She wanted to believe the latter, but the evidence accumulated daily made that explanation increasingly impossible. She wrote the date at the top of a new page and began recording breakfast, always documenting, always measuring, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. On December 1st, Mina Schultz and Trudy Wagner were assigned to kitchen duty. The camp commander had decided that giving prisoners productive work helped maintain morale and structure. Several women volunteered for kitchen assignments, partly because it kept them busy, partly because they wanted to understand the source of this impossible abundance. Mina had worked in field hospital kitchens preparing meals for wounded soldiers with whatever scarce ingredients were available. She understood institutional cooking, or thought she did until she walked into the American camp kitchen and saw something that shattered her remaining assumptions about wartime reality. The storage room was larger than the entire cooking facility at her field hospital in France. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, lined with cans, jars, sacks, and boxes. Industrial-sized containers of flour, sugar, coffee, canned vegetables, canned fruit, canned meat. 50-pound bags of potatoes and onions, cases of eggs stacked 4 high. Whole sides of beef hanging in a cold storage room that maintained temperature through electrical refrigeration, a technology Mina had only read about. An American cook, Sergeant Martha Reynolds, noticed their stunned expressions and smiled with mild amusement. "First time seeing an American military kitchen?" she asked kindly. Mina could only nod, unable to form words in English or German. Sergeant Reynolds gestured around the storage room. "This is standard supply for a facility our size. We get deliveries twice weekly from the regional depot, more often if we need something specific." Twice weekly. Deliveries. Mina tried to process this information. Her field hospital had received supply shipments once every 2 or 3 weeks, when they received them at all. Toward the end, before the Americans overran their position, they had gone nearly a month without any resupply. They had been rationing already inadequate stores, watering down soup until it was barely colored water, cutting bread rations in half and then half again. And this American camp, holding fewer than 50 prisoners, received deliveries twice per week. Trudy found her voice first. "All this food, it is for us? For prisoners?" Sergeant Reynolds looked confused. "Well, it's for everyone in the facility. Guards, staff, prisoners. We all eat the same meals from the same kitchen. Army regulations require equal rations regardless of status within approved camps." She paused, registering their shock. "You eat the same food as your guards back in Germany, right?" Mina almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. German guards and officers received better rations than prisoners or auxiliary personnel. Everyone knew that. Hierarchy determined access to resources. The strong ate better than the weak. That was simply how the world worked, except apparently not in America. Here, enemy prisoners ate the same meals as the soldiers guarding them. The same meat, the same butter, the same chocolate cake. Sergeant Reynolds put them to work peeling potatoes for dinner. As Mina worked, she watched the American cooks with growing astonishment. They threw away vegetable peels instead of saving them for soup stock. They discarded chicken bones after making a single batch of broth. They poured excess milk down the drain rather than rationing it carefully. The casual waste would have been criminal in Germany, yet here it was standard procedure because there was always more coming. Always another delivery. Always abundant supplies. Linda Koch sat in the barracks common room on a cold December evening, a blank piece of paper before her and a pencil in her hand. The camp allowed prisoners to write letters home, though mail delivery to Germany was impossible with the war still raging. Letters would be held until postal routes reopened after the conflict ended. Still, many women wrote anyway, needing some connection to the families they had left behind. Linda had tried 3 times to write to her mother in Saarbrücken. 3 times she had stared at the empty page, unable to find words that would make sense of her current reality. What could she possibly say? "Dear Mama, I am well fed as a prisoner in America. Better fed than you have been in years. I eat meat every single day, sometimes twice in one day. Yesterday they gave us roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, 3 different vegetables, fresh bread with real butter, and pumpkin pie with whipped cream. This was not a holiday meal. This was Thursday dinner. I wanted to write immediately and tell you about the abundance, but then I remembered that you are probably eating turnip soup and black bread if you are lucky. I remembered that food parcels cannot reach you. I remembered that telling you about my full stomach while yours stays empty would be the cruelest thing I could do. So instead, she wrote nothing. She held the pencil and imagined the letter she would send if honesty were possible without causing pain. I am learning that everything we were told about America was wrong, Mama. They are not weak. They are not starving. They are not desperate or failing. Their abundance is so overwhelming that they can afford generosity even to their enemies. I watch American guards throw away food that would feed our entire street for a week, and they do it without thought because there is always more. Always endless supplies arriving on trucks twice weekly. I do not understand how this is possible, but I see it every day. Around the common room, other women struggled with similar letters. Heidi had written 4 pages to her sister in Cologne describing the camp's library, the education classes, the work assignments, everything except the food. Mentioning food felt obscene when she had no way of knowing if her sister was even alive, if Cologne still stood, if anyone remained to receive letters when mail service resumed. Gisa had given up entirely on writing home. Her family in Dusseldorf had been in a heavily bombed industrial area. The likelihood that anyone survived to read her letters seemed remote enough that the exercise felt pointless. Trudy wrote to her mother every week despite the impossibility of delivery. She filled pages with careful descriptions of daily life, the weather, the other women, anything mundane and safe. She never mentioned food, never described meals, never acknowledged the central fact of their captivity, that they were being treated with incomprehensible kindness. How could she explain to her mother, who had watched 3 of her children die from malnutrition-related illnesses during the blockade years, that her daughter now ate chocolate cake as a Tuesday evening dessert? Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud, even in letters that might never be read. So Linda set down her pencil and folded the blank paper. Silence seemed more honest than lies. November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day in America. The German women had heard about this holiday from their English lessons with Sergeant Robert Chen, a patient teacher who explained American customs while helping them improve their language skills. Thanksgiving was a harvest celebration, he told them, a day when Americans gathered with family to share a special meal and express gratitude for their blessings. The women nodded politely, assuming this meant the camp would serve something slightly nicer than usual. They had no framework for understanding what Thanksgiving actually meant in a country where regular Tuesday dinners already exceeded their concept of celebration meals. The mess hall had been decorated overnight. Paper turkeys and autumn leaves hung from the walls. The tables were covered with cloths instead of being left bare wood. American staff members moved through the room with an energy that suggested genuine excitement about the day ahead. Heidi watched these preparations with growing anxiety. If normal American dinners were already incomprehensible, what would a special holiday meal look like? How much abundance could possibly fit on a single plate? When the food began arriving, carried by smiling cooks who seemed proud of their work, Heidi felt her breath catch in her throat. Each woman received a plate loaded with sliced, roasted turkey, the meat so moist it glistened, stuffing made with bread, herbs, and what appeared to be sausage, mashed potatoes with a crater of melted butter, sweet potato casserole topped with browned marshmallows, green bean casserole with crispy onions, cranberry sauce, both jellied and whole berry, a warm dinner roll with more butter, and on a separate smaller plate, a slice of pumpkin pie with a generous dollop of whipped cream. Gisa stared at her plates, plural, because one plate could not hold everything, and felt tears begin sliding down her cheeks. This was more food than her entire extended family would have eaten at Christmas dinner in the best years before the war. This was abundance beyond anything she had imagined possible, served casually to enemy prisoners on a Thursday afternoon because Americans had a holiday tradition of gratitude. The irony was so sharp, it felt like a knife. They were supposed to be grateful. That was the point of Thanksgiving. But how could she feel grateful for food when her family was starving? How could she eat this feast knowing her mother might be dead, her father might be dead, her younger brother might be conscripted and killed? And she was safe and well fed in enemy captivity. Around the hall, other women were crying too. Mina sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking as she looked at food she could not bring herself to touch. Trudy wiped at her eyes with trembling hands, trying to compose herself and failing. Lindy sat frozen, staring at the turkey with an expression of such profound grief that an American guard approached to check if she was ill. Even some of the American staff seemed affected by the prisoner's distress, their earlier excitement fading into uncomfortable awareness that this celebration was causing pain rather than joy. Corporal Harrison, who had been kind to the women since their arrival, spoke quietly to the group. "Ladies, I know this is hard. I know you're thinking about home and family, but you need to eat. Please, the food is here, and not eating won't help anyone back in Germany." Gisa Braun forced herself to take a bite of turkey, then another. Her body's desperate hunger fought against her mind's moral revulsion at consuming abundance while her family suffered. The turkey was perfectly cooked, tender and flavorful, better than any meat she remembered tasting. Each bite felt like a betrayal. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she was protecting her family, serving Germany so that her younger siblings could grow up safe and fed. Instead, she had ended up in American captivity, eating holiday feasts while they starved in the ruins of Dusseldorf. The contradiction was unbearable. She was grateful to be alive, grateful not to be starving, grateful that the Americans treated them with dignity rather than cruelty. But gratitude toward her captors felt like disloyalty to her country, to her family, to everything she had been raised to believe about duty and honor. How could she feel thankful for the same abundance that highlighted the suffering of everyone she loved? Mina had stopped crying enough to eat small bites of stuffing. As a nurse, she understood that refusing food was impractical self-destruction that served no useful purpose. Her body needed calories to function, but understanding did not ease the emotional torment. She thought about the wounded soldiers she had treated in France, young men who died not from their injuries, but from infections that spread through bodies too weakened by malnutrition to fight back. She had watched soldiers fade away because they lacked the protein and nutrients needed for healing. Now she sat before more protein than those dying men had consumed in weeks. Trudy had developed a ritual to cope with the guilt. Before each meal, she whispered a prayer in German, asking that her family somehow, impossibly, might also have food that day. She knew the prayer changed nothing, knew that her eating or not eating had zero impact on her mother's circumstances in Bonn, but the ritual helped her create some psychological separation between the act of consuming food and the moral weight of that consumption. It was magical thinking, childish even, but it allowed her to eat without completely drowning in self-hatred. The American staff had gone quiet, aware that something was very wrong, but uncertain how to address it. Sergeant Reynolds moved among the tables, refilling water glasses, her earlier pride in the Thanksgiving meal replaced by visible discomfort. Corporal Harrison stood near the wall, watching the crying women with an expression of helpless concern. He had grown up on an Iowa farm during the Depression, had known real hunger as a child when crops failed and money ran out, but he had never experienced anything like this, the peculiar torture of being well-fed while knowing that loved ones starved beyond reach. Eventually, the meal ended. Most women had eaten at least some of the food, driven by physical need, if not emotional comfort. They left the mess hall in silence, carrying their guilt like physical weight. That night in the barracks, conversations were subdued and fragmented. No one wanted to acknowledge what they were all thinking, that they were alive and fed and safe, and that these blessings felt more like curses when measured against the suffering they could not prevent. On December 5th, a new prisoner arrived at the camp. Margaret Falk, a 53-year-old woman who had served as a cook for Wehrmacht officers in Belgium before being captured during the Allied advance. Unlike the younger women, Margareta had worked in professional kitchens before the war, managing restaurants in Hamburg during the 1920s and 30s. She carried herself with the confident authority of someone who had spent decades supervising large-scale food preparation. The camp commander assigned her to work with Sergeant Reynolds, hoping her experience would be useful in the kitchen operations. Mina was on kitchen duty when Margaret arrived for her first shift. The older woman walked into the storage room, stopped abruptly, and stood motionless for nearly a minute, just staring at the shelves of supplies. Her face showed no emotion, but her hands gripped the doorframe hard enough that her knuckles turned white. Sergeant Reynolds, unaware of the reaction's significance, cheerfully began explaining the inventory system and meal rotation schedule. Margaret listened in silence, her expression carefully neutral, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts were moving behind her eyes. During their lunch break, the German women gathered around Margaret with desperate questions. They had been at the camp for nearly a month now, and the abundance still made no sense. Surely this older woman, with her professional experience and broader knowledge of the world, could explain what they were witnessing, could tell them if this was normal American food culture or some elaborate deception designed for purposes they had not yet identified. Margaret ate her lunch slowly, a sandwich made with thick slices of ham, cheese, lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise on fresh bread, before she finally spoke. "This is real," she said quietly in German. "This is actually how Americans eat." Her words carried the weight of reluctant authority. "I worked in kitchens that served wealthy customers before the war. I cooked for business owners, doctors, lawyers, people with money. The food we are being served here is better than what I prepared for Hamburg's upper class in 1935. Not by a little, by a significant margin. And they are feeding it to us 3 times daily as standard prisoner rations." Heidi leaned forward urgently. "But how? How can they afford this during wartime? We were told America was weak, that their economy collapsed, that their people were desperate." Margaret's laugh was bitter and tired. "We were told many things that were not true. I have been thinking about this since I arrived, trying to reconcile what I see with what I believed I knew about the world. The only explanation is that America's agricultural and industrial capacity is so vast that even fighting a 2-front war barely strains their resources. They produce more food than they need, much more. So much that they can feed prisoners like honored guests and barely notice the expense." The younger women absorbed this in stunned silence. Gisa finally whispered, "Then we never had any chance of winning, did we? If they have this much abundance during war, if they can afford this level of generosity to enemies, their capacity for actual military production must be—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Overwhelming," Margaret completed. "Yes, I suspect that is accurate." Mid-December brought the first mail from Germany since their capture. Not personal letters, those remained impossible, but official Red Cross communications about conditions in German cities. The reports were distributed to prisoners who had requested information about specific locations. Heidi received news about Cologne. Gisa got updates on Dusseldorf. The information was weeks old by the time it reached them, filtered through official channels, and translated into dry bureaucratic language that somehow made the horror worse by stating it so clinically. Cologne had been bombed repeatedly throughout October and November. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Civilian casualties numbered in the thousands. Food distribution systems had collapsed in several districts. The Red Cross was attempting to provide emergency rations, but supplies were inadequate for the population's needs. Estimated civilian rations in functioning distribution areas averaged 900 calories per day, less than 1/3 of what the German women were consuming as prisoners in America. And that was for civilians lucky enough to live in areas where distribution still functioned. Others were subsisting on whatever they could scavenge from ruins or purchase on black markets at prices that made food inaccessible for most families. Heidi read the report 3 times, her hands shaking worse with each reading. 900 calories. Her younger sister was in Cologne, or had been when Heidi last heard from her in July. The report made no mention of her family specifically, but statistics painted an obvious picture. If her sister was alive, she was starving, eating perhaps 1 meager meal daily while Heidi sat in Pennsylvania consuming 3 abundant meals. The guilt that had been manageable barely became suffocating. She had eaten eggs and bacon for breakfast that morning. Her sister, if alive, might have eaten a slice of bread and watery soup. Gisa's report about Dusseldorf was even worse. The industrial city had been a primary target for Allied bombing. The urban core was nearly completely destroyed. The report estimated that 70% of residential buildings were uninhabitable. Tens of thousands were homeless, living in cellars and basements, struggling to survive winter without adequate shelter or heating fuel. Food situation critical was the phrase used repeatedly. Critical meant people were dying of starvation, not hunger, not malnutrition. Actual starvation. Her family's neighborhood was in the devastated zone. The likelihood that they had survived both the bombs and the aftermath seemed remote. Mina's report about Essen described similar devastation. Trudy learned that Bonn had been heavily damaged. Lindy discovered that Saarbrücken was occupied by advancing Allied forces, all German civilians evacuated or fled, her mother's whereabouts unknown. Every piece of news made the same point with brutal clarity. Germany was dying, the people they loved were suffering beyond imagination, and they were safe, fed, comfortable in their captivity. That evening, no one ate dinner. The American cooks had prepared roasted pork with applesauce, scalloped potatoes, glazed carrots, and fresh baked bread. The smell that usually made their mouths water now made them feel sick. 47 women sat before full plates and could not bring themselves to lift their forks. Corporal Harrison tried to encourage them to eat, his voice gentle with concern, but he could not understand, could not comprehend the specific torture of consuming abundance while holding proof that your family was starving. Finally, he stopped trying and simply let them sit in their grief, the food growing cold on untouched plates. On a gray December morning, the women gathered in the camp's common room for their weekly discussion group. Captain Eleanor Shaw, the camp's welfare officer, had organized these meetings to help prisoners process their experiences and maintain mental health during captivity. Usually the conversations focused on practical matters like English lessons or work assignments. Today, with the devastating news from Germany still fresh, the discussion took a darker turn. Heidi spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we deserve this food?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "Our families are starving while we eat like royalty. How can that be right? How can we sit here consuming abundance when the people we were supposed to protect are dying?" Gisa added, "Every bite feels like theft, like I am stealing from my mother's mouth, from my brother's plate. The Americans give us this food freely, but that does not make accepting it moral. Perhaps we should refuse. Perhaps we should fast in solidarity with those suffering at home." Captain Shaw listened carefully before responding. "What would your refusal accomplish?" she asked gently. "Would your family receive the food you decline? Would your hunger ease their suffering in any measurable way?" Mina shook her head slowly. "No, but at least we would not be complicit in the obscenity of abundance during their starvation. At least we would suffer alongside them, rather than betraying them with our full stomachs," Trudy spoke up, her voice stronger than usual. "But is that not just self-indulgent guilt, making ourselves feel better by performing suffering while accomplishing nothing for those we claim to care about? Perhaps the moral choice is to eat, to stay healthy, to survive, so that when this war ends, we can return and help rebuild. Dead martyrs serve no one." The argument revealed the fundamental tension they all felt. Accepting American generosity felt like betrayal, but refusing it achieved nothing except their own deterioration. They were trapped in a moral paradox, with no good options, only degrees of compromise. Lind finally articulated what many were thinking. The real question is not whether we deserve this food. The question is why the Americans give it to us. We are their enemies. We serve the regime fighting against them. By all logic, they should feed us minimally. Instead, they feed us better than their own citizens ate during their depression. Why? Captain Shaw considered her response carefully. Perhaps because Americans believe that how you treat your enemies reveals who you are, more than how you treat your friends. Perhaps they are demonstrating that their values of human dignity apply even to those who fought against them. Or perhaps they simply have so much abundance that generosity costs them nothing. The women sat with this unsettling possibility, that their moral anguish over accepting abundance might matter less than they wanted to believe, that the Americans were not making a profound ethical statement, but simply acting from such overwhelming resources that feeding prisoners well was easier than calculating minimal rations. Despite Margaret's explanation about American abundance being real, despite weeks of consistent meals, despite every rational indication that food would continue, the German women could not stop hoarding. It started small and instinctive. Gisa slipped an extra dinner roll into her pocket one evening, wrapped in a napkin. She placed it in her footlocker under her spare clothes. The next morning at breakfast, she took 2 pieces of toast instead of 1, eating one immediately and saving the other. Within days, her footlocker contained half a dozen carefully wrapped food items. She was not alone. Heidi had begun saving packets of sugar from the coffee service, storing them in a cloth bag, counting them obsessively. Mina hoarded crackers from lunch service, stacking them in a tin box with ritualistic care. Trudy saved small portions of butter wrapped in wax paper. Lindy collected apples from the fruit bowl, lining them up on her windowsill where she could see them, though she never ate them and they slowly shriveled. The American staff noticed but said nothing initially. Corporal Harrison mentioned to Captain Shaw that he had seen food wrappers in the barracks, evidence that women were keeping provisions in their personal spaces. Captain Shaw instructed staff to ignore the behavior unless it created sanitation problems. They are processing trauma, she explained. Hoarding is a normal response to having experienced scarcity. It will fade when they feel secure. But it did not fade. If anything, the hoarding intensified as winter deepened. The women knew intellectually that breakfast would come every morning, that lunch would appear at midday, that dinner would be served each evening. But their bodies, trained by years of genuine scarcity, could not accept this knowledge. Some part of their nervous system remained convinced that the abundance would vanish, that they would wake one morning to find the Americans finally revealing their true intentions. Margaret understood this better than most. She had lived through the hyperinflation of the 1920s, had watched the German economy collapse, had seen middle-class families reduced to starvation when their savings became worthless overnight. She knew that abundance could disappear with terrifying speed, so she too hoarded despite her professional knowledge of food management, despite understanding American capacity for sustained provision. The hoarding created a strange shadow economy in the barracks. Women traded saved items with each other, not out of need, but from some compulsion to engage in resource management. 3 crackers for 2 sugar packets, an apple for a dinner roll, and butter. The exchanges made no practical sense since everyone had equal access to unlimited supplies. But the activity provided psychological comfort, a sense of control in circumstances where they controlled almost nothing. At night, women would wake and check their hoarded supplies, counting items in the darkness, reassuring themselves that resources existed, even while knowing that morning would bring more food than they could consume. January 8, 1945. Captain Shaw called an assembly in the main hall with an announcement that would force the German women to confront the choice they had been avoiding. Orders had come from Washington regarding repatriation procedures. All German prisoners of war would be returned to Europe within the next 6 months. processed through displaced persons camps, and released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. Transportation would begin in March for the first groups, with subsequent shipments following as space became available on vessels returning to Europe. The announcement should have brought relief. They were going home. After months of uncertainty and captivity, they would finally return to Germany, to their families, to whatever waited in the ruins of their former lives. But as Captain Shaw explained the timeline and procedures, Heidi felt something cold settle in her stomach. That had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a terrible realization she had been suppressing for weeks. She did not want to go back. The thought was treasonous, shameful, a betrayal of everything she had been raised to believe about duty and loyalty. But it was also undeniably true. The Germany she had served no longer existed. Her family might be dead, her city was destroyed, and even if her loved ones had survived, what could she offer them? She would return as a failed soldier, a woman who had been captured and fed by the enemy, tainted by comfortable captivity while they suffered. She would be another mouth to feed in a country where food scarcity meant death. Around her, the other women's faces reflected similar calculations. Gisa thought about returning to the ruins of Dusseldorf with no skills except supply clerking, a profession that meant nothing in a destroyed economy. Mina considered going back to practice nursing without medicines, equipment, or even basic supplies in hospitals that were themselves bombed shells. Trudy imagined arriving in Bonn to discover her entire family dead, finding herself completely alone in a devastated city. Linda pictured Saarbrücken under occupation, her mother gone, nothing remaining of the life she had known. But the alternative, staying in America, seemed equally impossible. They were enemy prisoners, not immigrants. They had no legal right to remain. They spoke limited English and had no connections outside the camp. Even if the Americans allowed them to stay, what kind of life could they build as former enemy soldiers in a country they had been trained to hate? Captain Shaw continued explaining procedures, but Heidi barely heard. Her mind was calculating something more immediate and visceral. If she returned to Germany, she would be hungry again, not occasionally, chronically, desperately, constantly hungry in a country where food systems had collapsed. She would return to the state of slow starvation she had escaped by being captured. And now, after months of abundance, after her body had finally begun to recover, the thought of choosing to return to hunger felt impossible. She looked at the other women and saw the same terrible arithmetic playing out behind their eyes. The choice was not really about homeland versus captivity. It was about starvation versus abundance, about death versus life. And that made the decision both simple and absolutely devastating. The weeks following the repatriation announcement were the most difficult since their arrival. The women divided into factions based on different assessments of impossible choices. Some, like Trudy, decided immediately that duty required return, regardless of circumstances. Her mother was in Bonn, probably alive since the Red Cross had confirmed her neighborhood still stood. Trudy could not abandon her to face post-war hardship alone. She would go back, would share whatever suffering awaited, would fulfill her obligations as a daughter, even if it meant returning to hunger. Others, like Linda, had no family left to return to. The Red Cross had confirmed her mother's death during the evacuation of Saarbrücken. She had no siblings, no close relatives, nothing waiting in Germany except ruins and memories. For her, the question became existential rather than familial. What did she owe a country that had fed her lies, that had led her into a war based on false premises, that had committed atrocities she was only now beginning to understand? Heidi spent hours in the camp library reading American newspapers, trying to understand what kind of country she might be choosing if she stayed. The articles revealed a nation preparing for post-war dominance, planning massive reconstruction programs for Europe, debating the creation of international organizations to prevent future conflicts. America saw itself as the victor who would reshape the world order, and that self-perception was not entirely propaganda. Gisa approached the decision with her characteristic need for documentation. She made lists comparing return versus staying, assigning weights to different factors, trying to quantify the unquantifiable, family obligation versus survival probability, duty to homeland versus duty to self. The moral weight of abandoning Germany versus the practical reality that one starving woman could contribute nothing to reconstruction. Her lists filled pages, but brought no clarity. Mina discussed the choice with Sergeant Reynolds during kitchen duty. The American cook listened without judgment as Mina worked through her confusion. "My nursing skills could help people in Germany," Mina said slowly. "There will be tremendous need for medical care, but I would be practicing without supplies, without medicines, watching people die from preventable causes. Here in America, I could continue training, could become a real nurse with actual resources." Sergeant Reynolds considered this carefully. "Sounds like you are trying to convince yourself that the selfish choice is actually the selfless one. Maybe it is. Maybe it is not. But be honest about your motivations. If you stay because you want to live instead of merely surviving, that is not shameful. Choosing life is not betrayal." By late January, a tentative consensus had emerged. Approximately 15 women would request permission to remain in America if such permission were possible. The others would accept repatriation, would return to face whatever awaited them. Both groups respected the other's choice, while privately believing their own decision was correct. March 15, 1945. The first repatriation group prepared to leave the Pennsylvania camp. 28 women, including Trudy Wagner, boarded trucks that would take them to the port in New York. They carried small bags containing their few possessions and letters from American staff members attesting to their good conduct during captivity. Captain Shaw had worked tirelessly to arrange special processing for those who wished to remain, navigating bureaucratic channels and arguing that these women posed no security threat and could become valuable bridges between former enemies. Heidi stood in the compound yard, watching her friends prepare to leave. Trudy embraced her tightly, both women crying openly. "Tell your mother about the Salisbury steak," Heidi whispered. "Tell her that even in the darkest times, unexpected kindness exists." Trudy nodded, unable to speak, then climbed into the truck with the others. The convoy rolled away slowly, leaving 19 women standing in the yard, facing entirely uncertain futures. The legal status of those remaining was complicated. They were no longer prisoners of war, but not yet immigrants. Captain Shaw had secured temporary authorization for them to stay as displaced persons pending proper immigration applications. They would need sponsors, employment, and housing. Within weeks, local families who had visited the camp through church programs stepped forward. The Henderson family offered to sponsor Heidi. Dr. Robert Hayes arranged for Mina to continue nursing training at Worcester General Hospital. Gisa found work as a translator for a government agency processing European refugees. The transition was harder than any of them anticipated. Freedom meant making choices about every aspect of daily life after months of structured routine. Heidi struggled with crushing guilt every time she sat down to a meal, thinking about Trudy arriving in devastated Bonn. The abundance that had shocked her upon arrival now felt normal, which somehow made it worse. She had adjusted to American plenty while her family suffered. But slowly, painfully, the women who stayed began building lives. Mina excelled in her nursing program, her dedication driven by desire to honor those she could not help in Germany. Gisa's language skills made her invaluable in refugee processing. Linda found work in a factory, saving money obsessively, still hoarding, though she now hoarded dollars instead of dinner rolls. Letters eventually arrived from those who had returned. Trudy wrote that conditions in Germany were exactly as terrible as they had feared, but reunion with her mother made the suffering bearable. Others described slow reconstruction and persistent hunger. Years later, when scholars studied this unusual case, they focused on strategic implications and policy questions. But for the women themselves, the choice had always been simpler and more painful. They had chosen between starvation and abundance, between dying slowly in ruins or living in a strange land. They had chosen survival, and they carried that choice like a wound that never fully healed but eventually became bearable. The Salisbury steak dinners continued every Tuesday, ordinary and abundant, a weekly reminder of the impossible feast that had changed everything.